The Russian war on Ukraine continues to increase in intensity and in savagery, as Ukrainian civilians are dying in ever-increasing numbers. But on Friday, NATO leaders repeated that they have no intention of trying to implement a NATO-imposed no-fly zone in Ukrainian airspace. Joining me now is Christian Leuprecht. He's a professor of military studies at Royal Military College and political science at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. First of all, Professor Leuprecht, as I mentioned, NATO again has said that there will be no NATO planes over Ukraine. We heard that from Jens Stoltenberg today. Go over the rationale for that refusal or what they're saying.
Well, this goes back to President Biden's interview before the Super Bowl, where he made it clear that he's withdrawing all U.S. forces from Ukraine because any direct contact between U.S. forces and Russian forces, and by extension NATO forces, could ostensibly result in World War III. So the results could be incalculable. But I would say that there's a lot more nuance to this statement from Jens Stoltenberg than appears, because, of course, the Ukrainian Air Force is still somewhat intact. That is to say, the Russians do not have control over Ukrainian airspace, and presumably that's both to the thanks of intelligence as well as maintenance support from NATO member countries. And there's also been significant anti-aircraft capability, Stinger missiles and other technology that's been provided to the Ukrainians. So if you're a Russian pilot, whether fixed wing or rotary wing, the Ukrainian skies are getting increasingly dangerous for you, and we can see this in over 30 fixed wing and 30 rotary wing aircraft having been downed by Ukrainian air defenses.
Okay, there you're teaching me something, because if we just look at the images, the average Western viewer has the impression that the Russians have command of the skies, because we're seeing, for example, cruise missile damage and artillery damage, but you're saying that no, that the Ukrainian Air Force still does have some degree of mastery of their skies?
They do, and the Russians also don't control the automated space. That is to say, even the cruise missiles are subject to being shot down, as we saw a couple days ago over Kiev. Now, of course, sometimes they succeed with the airstrikes, but the Ukrainians have proven as agile in their air defenses and are even still able to carry out some airstrikes on Russian targets, as they have proven on the ground, I think, much to everybody's amazement, in particular because traditionally Ukrainian armed forces had trouble at interoperations between, for instance, ground forces and air forces. And so that's one of the things that the NATO training mission, or I should say the US, UK, Canadian training mission there since 2015 has evidently significantly improved in terms of coordination.
Okay, training mission. The other thing, though, too, is that we've been told that Canada is helping pay for it, but we're also told that the United States is helping provide it, and that is intelligence direct satellite communications in terms of where Russian forces are. How much is that part of them controlling the skies, or is that just in terms of trying to deal with the Russian invaders?
No, so what NATO and the Americans are likely providing here is full domain awareness in terms of intelligence, so open source as well as classified sources, satellite and geostrategic intelligence, as well as signals intelligence, so that's to say communications. So the ability to pull all that intelligence and provide a fully integrated, holistic intelligence picture. And you would think that that's a part of the reason why the Ukrainians are able to be so agile on the ground with their forces in terms of targeting Russian convoys on the main roads that they're taking, as well as the ability to continue to sustain themselves in the air. The challenge here is, of course, that the Ukrainians will increasingly start running short on materiel to be able to do that, because the Russians outgun them about 10 to 1, and the Ukrainians are going to run short also probably on their air force because the Russians are going to succeed in taking out some of their assets. And this is why the Ukrainians are calling for more drones, more air capability, and more air defense capabilities. So the intelligence is clearly what's making, I would say, all the difference here, in addition to the heroic bravery of many of the Ukrainians that are fighting on the ground.
And when, as we just had a Ukrainian member of parliament, when they continue to ask and say we need a no-fly zone, the answer is?
That NATO is not going to take that risk for the time being. I do think there is a prospect of potentially escalating. I suspect the Russians will start targeting the supply convoys that are running from Poland into Ukraine. And it's entirely conceivable that as the Russians do this with cruise missiles, one of those might stray into Polish territory, at which point Poland would call in Article 5 under the NATO treaty. And at that point, NATO would need to stand united with Poland, as I think they will. And at that point, NATO will get drawn into the conflict.
So you're describing a very, very volatile, very, very dangerous situation.
We have the largest country in the world with a very capable military fighting the largest country in Europe with a very significant and challenging terrain. And so it means that any sort of affrontment, any confrontation between the two was always going to have very significant potential for spillover effects beyond the boundaries of Ukraine. And I think we need to all be prepared for that eventuality.
Day by day, we're seeing an increasing intensity, and I'm calling it increasing barbarism and increasing savagery with these missile and bomb and artillery attacks hitting civilian targets. I mean, killing more and more civilians at a greater rate. Should we expect this to be what we're going to see for the next few weeks, and even more so?
It's important to understand this is not by accident, this is by intent. It is part of Russian military doctrine. Atrocities, grave human rights violations. The Wagner groups are Putin's private military corporation. Its operations in Africa, it's been sanctioned by the European Union for its human rights abuses. If we look at the way the Russian forces conducted themselves in Chechnya, where they razed an entire city that resisted them, and if you look at Syria, where Russian forces engaged, among other things, in carpet bombing against civilian populations, this is part of Russian doctrine to demoralize local populations, to try to break the back of local resistance with overwhelming firepower. And we are now seeing Russian doctrine in full effect in Ukraine. And so I would conjecture that it is likely going to get very ugly for local populations in the coming days.
I guess that's the other question for the public and for political decision makers as we watch this, as everyone who's in the know is predicting it's going to get much, much, much worse. What do you make of it in terms of what the options that this leaves for shocked Western populations?
Well, I think we need to settle in for the long haul. There's a few ways that this could play out. One is that the Russians take a Chechnya-style scorched earth approach to Ukraine and raze their cities. Another is that the Russians eventually take Kiev and achieve their initial objective of overturning the government in Kiev and install their puppet regime, in which case we're likely going to see an Afghanistan-style 1980s war of attrition against the Russians. The Russians have already lost reportedly 9,000 servicemen. They lost a total of 13,000 servicemen over 10 years in Afghanistan. So this is already extremely bloody for the Russians, and NATO has signaled it's going to get a lot bloodier. But there is also now, I think, an inkling of hope that the defenders may actually be able to hold Kiev, that they can hold off the columns that are approaching on Kiev from the east and from the south, and that they may be able to stop the encirclement. I think this is what the supply lines are currently about. And if the defenders were able to hold Kiev, that would be a turning point in the war, because it would mean that Putin has failed at his fundamental objective for this invasion in the first place.
Okay, Professor Leuprecht, we will no doubt check in with you again. I want to thank you very much for speaking with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.